I'm Lobsang Yendak, Executive Director of the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy.
And can you tell us very briefly what the Center for Human Rights and Democracy does?
Our center basically has two major objectives. One is to monitor human rights abuses taking place in Tibet and also to document them and disseminate the information to the international community, and also to educate our community on the values and principles of human rights and democracy. So these are the two basic objectives the center has.
Right. How do you go about fulfilling those objectives?
We basically conduct interviews to many of the recent rebels from Tibet. So we have 4 field offices in total, 2 in Nepal and 2 in Dharamsala. So they conduct interviews to each and every Tibetan refugees who escape from Tibetan rebels in India.
How many Tibetan refugees escape each year?
The number has been fluctuating over the last few years, but in average we can say 96, 97 there were around 4,000 refugees, and in 1998 our estimation is around 6,000.
So the numbers are going up, you think?
It has grown up, particularly because we feel that the human rights situation inside Tibet for the last 3 years have been worsening, and because of that very reason the influx of refugees have increased.
In what way is the situation worsening?
In fact, since the Communist China occupied Tibet in 1959, violations of Tibetan people have been going on. But then over the last 3 years, particularly when the Chinese government launched the so-called Strikeout campaign throughout China and in Tibet, and that campaign has really intensified the repression of the Tibetan monks and nuns and also of the lay community.
What is the Strikeout campaign?
Strikeout campaign, that is a national campaign launched by the Chinese government in China. The very motive in launching this campaign in China is to eradicate the widespread corruption practices and to end crimes. But then when it was launched in Tibet simultaneously in April 1996, the purpose or the motive of launching that campaign was to suppress the nationalistic attitudes of the Tibetan people. So, which means by undertaking this patriotic re-education campaign, the Tibetan people have been denied the very basic freedom of expression and opinion. And because of that, lots of arbitrary arrests has taken place. Around now, for the last 3 years, around 9,700 Tibetan monks and nuns have been expelled from their monasteries, and as a result of that campaign we have recorded some 492 arrests of monks and nuns. So because of these reasons, I think many refugees.
I see. So 4,000 or 5,000 refugees a year are coming out of Tibet. You've mentioned that some of those are monks and nuns. What about the others? Who are they?
When we study the ratio of the refugees, we felt that the major chunk of the refugees, besides monks and nuns, are the children.
Children?
Yeah. For example, like this year, take over 6,000 refugees. Out of these, over 2,000 are children.
How old are these children?
Children, we normally classify children below the age of 18. That's the international standard of recognizing juvenile. So we also have been trying to study why so many of Tibetan children refugees are escaping from Tibet. Basically, the only reason is the lack of educational opportunities in Tibet. We have already done a research on the education status in Tibet, whereby we found that Tibetan children are discriminated seriously under the Chinese set up schools, and because of prohibitively high fees, many Tibetan children cannot get themselves admitted into different schools. And also at the same time, because of Chinese language, which is being taught as a medium of instruction in many in almost all Tibetan schools, and even to get in, admit, entrance into schools, you need to give an entrance examination. That too are conducted in Chinese. So, definitely the Tibetan children are disadvantaged, and that's why education system in Tibet is not accessible to the Tibetan children.
Hopping over the Himalayas is difficult for anyone, but it must be particularly difficult for children. Do the children come by themselves, or who brings them?
Of course, there are great risk of children fleeing Tibet, particularly crossing over the high Himalayan mountains. And as a result, we have cases of many children having frostbite and also children dying while escaping, through the Himalayas. But we understand all the risk involved there. But the major issue here is why the children, despite knowing that escaping over the Himalayas, sending their children with a stranger all the way entails such a great risk. But despite that, the parents are determined to send their children to India for better education. And there is a risk for the parents. First of all, the Chinese government, if they comes to know about that the parents have sent their children into exile schools, we will definitely have a problem. And secondly, also, once they send their children to exile, they may not see their children their once lifetime. It's a big question mark.
It's a very big thing to do. Can we look now at the political situation within Tibet? Could you tell us something about that?
Yes, this year we have recently done the 1998 annual report on the human rights situation in Tibet. And we have recorded the current political prisoner in various Chinese prisons in Tibet is 1,083. And out of these, 246 are Tibetan women political prisoners, and only 12 are juvenile political prisoners at this stage. Of course, what to talk about the fundamental human rights of the political prisoners in Tibet really was. And to give you an instance, like this May 1st and May 4, there was a major protest by political prisoners in Trapji prison. Trapji prison is the Tibet Autonomous Region's prison number 1, so it's considered most notorious prison in Tibet. So in that very prison, over 500 political prisoners and political prisoners during a function, they have resorted to a peaceful protest with the Chinese authorities. But as a result, to quell this protest, Chinese officials, policemen have opened fire indiscriminately. And we have reported 11 deaths that has occurred simply because of the peaceful protest. So that very incident was kept totally secret. That's something very astounding. For example, say on May the 4th, the European Union Troika delegations was in Trapji prison, but they were unaware of any such incident. So we can see that the Chinese government is very clever in sense of disguising everything.
So how did you get to know about that incident?
We were directly contacted by Tibetans inside Tibet about the incidents. And first of all, we came to know about the shootings and the incidents, but we didn't came to know about any deaths as such. So gradually, we have been trying to monitor very seriously for the past 2-3 months. Then later, we could get in details about what exactly the situation had happened.
Some of the refugees coming out of Tibet have been victims of torture within Tibet. Would you like to tell us something about what they have gone through?
In fact, I can say that almost all the political prisoners and prisoners of conscience in Tibet have been the victims of torture. So it depends about the degree of torture they have suffered or undergone. For example, say the Chinese government has signed and ratified the International Covenant on against torture. So this law prohibits the government of China to use torture. But then since 1987, when China signed that covenant, we have recorded 60 cases of torture due to death. Like, if I tell you one or two incidents of torture practices that are
Please
taking
do.
place in Tibet, there was one political prisoner who was handcuffed for a whole day around a hot chimney. So, he himself has testified that during all these 12 hours of, tying him, handcuffing him around the chimney, he was not given any water, he was not given any food, and the heat of that chimney has burnt his body, and then all of his bodies got blisters, and when he was finally released, he could see that from the blisters the water came down, and his whole shoes were soaked with water. So this is one incident of the torture practices in Tibet, and we have also received lots of cases about using of electric cattle prods. And this electric cattle prods is widely used in prisons in Tibet, particularly to Tibetan nuns and lay women, and of course at the same time to the men. But the Chinese officials target more towards Tibetan nuns, political prisoners. We have many cases of this electric cattle prod being inserted into nuns' vagina, anus, mouth. So these degrading practices have been taking place for the last many years, and it still continues to, be in practice.
Those people must need a very special kind of treatment by the time they get into Dharamsala. What do you do with them?
Yes. In fact, the Tibetan government itself has a torture victim section under the health department. So they are looking after all those torture victims, not only the physical one, but mentally, because they need some psychological, consultations, and these are all being taken care by that very torture victim section.
It would be a very difficult job to do. How do you cope with it on a personal basis?
It's very true. Like now, I have been working in this center as the director for the last 2.5 years. So our job, when we monitor human rights abuses in Tibet, when we interview scores of Tibetan people, despite, like say, we try to campaign cases of political prisoners internationally, seeking their support, trying to pressurize the Chinese government to comply with the international instruments and law. But despite all this campaigning, lobbying, appealing, the Chinese government has not attempted to improve the human rights situation in Tibet. And that's very, 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 personally speaking, disappointing. At the same time, it's very hurtful. Sometimes we feel that we are successful in one terms of documenting the human rights abuses in Tibet, but we are not successful in terms of alleviating the sufferings of the Tibetan people inside Tibet. So this is a major disappointment in my work so far as to say. Like even I personally went to the Chinese embassy in New Delhi to take up a case of an old ailing mother whose son is in prison in Tibet, and I personally went there, appealed the Chinese authorities on the humanitarian ground to please permit an old mother whose only last wish is to see her son before she dies, but then all neglected. So when such a response from the authorities, which we try to appeal for the last many years, as being all not listened, so it's really very, very hurtful.